attendance to start. Welcome everyone to the second day of our symposium. It's lovely to see you here. We had a really exciting evening with Tim Ingold last night, and I look forward to a great series of presentations today. We're attempting something really interdisciplinary, people with very different voices, trying to engage in conversations around what we see as quite important topics. So thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoy. I'm going to hand over to Godofredo Pereira, who heads up the Environmental Architecture Program at the RCA, who's chair of our first session. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm kind of wondering, do we need to keep all the, like, a layer of 2 rows without anyone? Perhaps you want to come closer since there's no one here at the moment. So, without further ado, this is a limited panel. We have limited time. I'll just like to say it's an immense pleasure to be here hosting, let me stay in this place, introducing this panel and the next 3 speakers, and actually simply to be part of this amazing event today. Such a pleasure. I will not take much time introducing the panel. I'll start by introducing just the quick bio of each of the speakers, so as to leave them time for all of us actually to listen to the presentation. So the first presentation is by Alexandra Arenes. Alexandra is an architect, co-founder of SOC, which produces cartographic tools for the arts and sciences. She collaborates on exhibitions, theatre and publication projects. She's pursuing a PhD at the University of Manchester on the theme Architectural Design at the Time of the Anthropocene, a Gaia graphic approach to the critical zones. So thank you very much, Alexandra, and leave it to you.
Maybe it's working. So you can listen to me? Yeah? Okay. So thank you for having me today. I'm very pleased to open the day on grounds and come after the wonderful evening lecture we had yesterday. And I hope you will see some parallels with the project of the mapping of the critical zone that is still a work in progress, but which has been developed in a collaborative work with a geoscientist, Jérôme Gaillardet, from IPGP in France, and a philosopher, Bruno Latour, I would certainly know, in a paper called Given Death to the Surface, a Gaia-graphy of the critical zone that you can find in the Anthropocene review. So the notion of the critical zone is a scientific object of inquiry, which was first coined by geoscientists almost 20 years ago, actually at the same time of the notion of the Anthropocene. And the critical zone encompasses the different layers of the soil layers, from the deep rocks to the tree canopy, and recognizes their interdependencies in the formation of the Earth. So it is this zone of interpretations that Tim Ingold talked yesterday. And it is a product of chemical weathering and erosion, which transfers the water, gas, and minerals that will eventually form the soil where we live, actually. And even if the critical zone encompasses the Earth, it is not the entire globe, but just the thin layer of few kilometers where life is possible, but now also threatened by climate change. However, the critical zone is also a network of geoscientists trying to collectively understand environmental issues on various types of land through the study of complex cycles that occur at the interfaces of soils, atmosphere, and rocks. And they ground their studies in local observatories, which range from a few hectares to large watersheds, such as Amazon basin. And in these landscape laboratories, they study geomorphology, water circulation, and chemical exchanges, such as the circulation of carbon, nitrates, phosphorus, sulfur, either activated by microorganisms and bacteria or disturbed by human activities like agriculture and industry. So to study these processes, they install instruments in the landscape, extract measurements, their data, and bring the data back to laboratories to gain a better understanding of the processes. For example, in the river lab, they record chemical components of the water that allow them to predict floods as the chemical composition of the river changes shortly before the flood event. In another case, in the Vosges forest, they are able to trace the origin of the sulfur that causes acid rain and tree death. They follow the water cycle using a sophisticated gravimeter that measures groundwater at certain depth, or they simply dig holes in the ground to follow the water path. So to report on the quality of the water that supplies the local residents, they must use geochemical devices to track the components. And what I find interesting is that they are redefining what the landscape is. Indeed, the instruments allow them to visualize the internal movements of nature, chemical flows of microorganisms, temperature changes, and pollution. So it's a device or a kind of way to monitor the health of a landscape by studying at different depths and heights the multiple phenomena that shape a landscape. So it could be air turbulence, seismic movements, chemical transport of pollutants in different parts of the earth, or electricity in the soil, exchanges between roots and fungi, chemical transport of tree molecules by leaves, wind speed, and much more. So therefore, the critical zone offers a better understanding of nature, not as a passive background for human activities, but as a dynamic process of terrestrial cycles where humans and non-humans are included in the kind of same vortex of things. However, in their conventional representation of the critical zone, the scientists still rely on the image of the globe, which does not help us to see the critical zone, as it is actually a very thin layer on its surface. And similarly, in the conventional representation of a territory, geographers rely on the latitude-longitude system that still obscures the different soil layers and their interactions by flattening, superimposing, and confounding the layers with each another. So the traditional mappings does not allow the critical zone to be seen, freezing landscape features into a single state and excluding their changing states, as in the water cycle. And as Dilip Dacuna argues in his book, The Invention of Rivers, that you certainly know, the river as such is a cartographic invention made by drawing a boundary between soil and water and obscuring rainfall phenomena, and thus excluding the possibility of showing the connection between rain and soil that could be understood by degrees of wetness and not as a stable and non-living element. The axonometric view of the cross-section used by scientists and landscape designers as well is not efficient either, because it is necessary to add, in a superficial way, arrows to convey cycles. Thus, it makes very difficult to decipher the causal link between processes and land formation. So these mapping methods restrict our understanding of a landscape, focusing on measurements of the surface, and not rendering the complexities, the movements, and changes of entities found where we look closer at the processes, as the two renderings shows us. The one is made here by the Monsoon student, and the other one is from the critical zone scientist, so there is kind of connection between the two of them. So I will present now how we, step by step, we process to do the model of the critical zone. The first idea was to change the framework of cartography from a Cartesian longitude-latitude system to a model where we can see depth and also shift from an outside view of the globe to an inside perspective from the ground. And indeed, a visualization of the critical zone should put the observer in the ground, inside the many envelopes that constitute the Earth, from the surface to the depth. With this objective in mind, we have begun to experiment with diagrams. And so the first challenge that we faced was to more accurately account for the spatiality of the ground and our position within it. That is, not as a surveyor outside of it, but as an observer inside, folded in its envelopes. So the third gesture was to open up the globe to look inside it. But in doing this, we found that the Earth core took too much space, while the critical zone, that is the soils and atmosphere, was made invisible. As the soil is the most important layer for living beings, we had come up with the idea to reverse the skin of the Earth like a glove, to turn it inside out, so in order to place the critical zone at the center of the diagram, and the Earth core at the periphery, since the periphery it's the most remote part of the planet for us, that is the mantle and the Earth core. Thus, in our critical zone views, the lower atmosphere is now in the center, the topsoil in the middle, and the deep rocks and continental crust at the periphery. And in this way, we try to give the idea that we are no longer located on the surface of a planet, but inside it. So we developed this in another view. Here we have reconstructed the envelopes deployed around an observer from the atmosphere, then the soils, and finally the underground, conveying each time a different and particular vision from within the Earth. So the advantage of this visualization is that the lower atmosphere at the center of the diagram no longer floats in unlimited space, but is strongly coupled with the surface of the ground. This means that if we pollute the atmosphere, there is no over horizon from which we could escape, contrary to the impression given by the traditional vision of the globe floating in the universe. So here pollution is kept inside, as it is in reality. As a result, from the map, at the edge of the vortex of the atmosphere, with the soil, fractures, trees, and roots all around us, we can also witness all kinds of anthropogenic ruins buried in the ground and weighing on us. This is a depiction of the many agents that shape these soils, and our attempt here is to give the possibility to represent more precisely and with more space and detail the soils, and to give the impression of being inside a set of envelopes. Another question we faced was how to convey time through our maps. Since we could say that the Anthropocene is a result of a poor consideration of the cycles leading to their description in time and space, how can we better visualize these terrestrial processes? The historian of philosophy Helmut Müller-Sievers explained that cartography based on the Cartesian grid ignores death, growth, and time. He argues that instead we can look to chemistry rather than physics for a representation of space that includes time, because it is a science of becoming, of attraction and growth. As he writes, chemical processes build up the content of the Earth from its inner core outward, and thus regulates the qualitative distribution of matter upon its surface. Chemism provides a dimension of depth that is inaccessible to any geography based on the geometry of surfaces. It is not the only third dimension of physical space, but the dimension of manifest time of geological history. So to insert a temporal dimension into our previous model to express growth, we converted the circles previously seen topographically into cycles, so understood synematically. Biogeochemical cycles, that the critical zone scientists studied, vary enormously over time, so from microseconds in the atmosphere to billions of years in deep rocks. And two main sources of energy animate these terrestrial cycles: the sun from above and the tectonic movements from below, as we can see in this axonometric view of the model, so in order to place the axis of the sun. And both sun and deep energy makes the energetic maelstrom of life. So it is both a kind of geocentric and heliocentric view, or we can also call it a Gaia-centric view in connection with the Lovelock-Margulis hypothesis. Indeed, the Gaia hypothesis argues that living beings generate or destroy their own living conditions using the sun and deep earth energy, and ultimately that it is their actions that terraform the earth, shape landscapes by activating cycles in the critical zone. Therefore, the problem is how to trace a cycle or how to follow a process occurring at a particular moment at a particular site. So to represent the dynamic nature of geochemical and hydrological cycles, we propose to follow a process on a given site, not by its longitude and latitude as in the Cartesian grid, but by the way in which a chemical component bifurcates from one cycle to the next, that is, from one strata to another, in the atmosphere, soil, deep rocks, and crust. So instead of mapping the position of a place, it is about mapping the signature of cycles or events. And we define such signatures by the way they create a spiral. So in the time left, I will give you an example to understand how our spiral grammar works. In this short animation depicting the carbon cycle. So first, we construct the model as we saw previously with the continental crust, the rocks, the topsoils, and the atmosphere. And then we add cycles depicted as moving spirals. So the spirals move either in the centripetal direction or in the centrifugal direction, depending on whether the element traced rises to the surface, that is from depth to surface center, or sinks into deep rocks, that is from the surface to depth periphery. This movement generates the cycle that we can decompose in different phenomena. For carbon, the sequence is photosynthesis, respiration, humidification, oxidation, exportation of organic matter, and subduction. So a cycle progresses at more or less high velocities, and the velocity here is represented by the different degrees of the spiral's angle. So a fast cycle is represented by an acute spiral angle, while a long cycle is represented by a flat angle, so it takes more time to go through the circles. And it's mostly occur in deep rocks layers because it is only activated by the slow activity of the mantle. On the other hand, we can see by a vertical line, so the sevens, I don't know if you read it, the human signature, which quickly brings back, therefore perpendicular to the circle strata, the carbon from the outer envelopes to the center. So it is human emission. Sorry. It is a 7. You can read it. So the human signature is kind of shortcut through the Earth layers, disturbing the carbon cycle. And as you know, human industry is an accelerator of CO2 circulation. And thus here, we try to convey the idea that humans can appear for what they are geochemically at the time of the Anthropocene, so exchangers, switches, shape changers, and interchanges of cycles. And lastly, we thought about water. Water is important because it transports many chemical components. So depending on the quality of soils, water has different paths and patterns through the layers of the critical zone. And each soil is specific, particular, so the way water circulates and is stored in the soil is also specific. Here we have the Amazon basin made with the model. Is characterized by multiple underground water channels flowing at the same time. So I will pass quickly because I don't have time. And here is the Orgeval basin in France, which is characterized by what we can call a sandwich of groundwater due to sandwich layers. And here is a karst region in Brittany characterized by its fractured soil, where water infiltrates deeper than we had previously thought, and thus can feed underground life forms. So a river is much more than a line that horizontally cuts the soil at the surface. The territory is like a sponge, as D'Acunha would say it, and the soils are degrees of wetness. And in addition, each soil is a distinct sponge with its own pattern. Therefore, critical zones cover the globe, but the situations are heterogeneous. The soils, the water flowing through them, but also the nutrients, the disturbances and pollution, the fauna and flora, and so on. To conclude, Quares's famous axiom, from the closed world to an infinite universe, has been widely used in cartography and astronomy. We hope with this model to turn it inside out like a glove in order to suggest this formula instead from a closed universe to an infinite world, as Emily Ash, French philosopher, suggests in her eponymous book. Indeed, despite the closure of the Earth induced by the model, something remains infinite. It is no longer the Cartesian space of extensiveness, progress, and land appropriation, but instead the complex geochemical cycles folded, intertwined, and formed by life. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. An amazing presentation. The next speaker, Christina Geros, is an architect, landscape architect, and urban designer specializing in conducting and designing research about the intricate relationships between urbanism, ecology, and politics. Currently a research fellow with Monsoon Assemblages and a studio tutor at the MA Environmental Architecture at the RCA. Her previous work with Pan-Exact Office and Peta Bencana in Jakarta, Indonesia, informs her current practice of designing engagements, implementations, and interfaces of investigation that reach across platform, scope, and inquiry. Thank you very much, Christina.
Thank you. I can't really thank myself for inviting myself, but thank you all for being here. Okay. So about a month ago, on the 25th of February, Natalie Wolchover published an article in Quantum magazine entitled "A World Without Clouds." And in this article, a group of scientists from around the world and from across scientific disciplines, from atmospheric sciences to paleoceanography, considered the role of clouds in determining climate futures and climate histories. For a long since concluded chapter in scientific history, the studies of these scientists bring into focus the value of knowing of an individual form, albeit the form of an individual that can only be studied at a single moment, one all about presence, the present tense, and the beholder. In the early 19th century, of course, science did not possess the technology to see the world as we do now. Yet, even as the discourse of geology moved towards the study of these mass movements, with meteorology following this trend to focus on the observation of global cloud systems, rather than individual forms, those men, we can call them scientists or adventurers or explorers, who were devoted to the study of clouds, the science of nephology, literally bet their lives on the value of knowing the difference between individual forms of moisture and particulates in the air. The nephologist and the sailor had much in common, a yearning to know, to see, to touch something beyond what they could currently view, and the inner kind of daredevil enough to either sail to the edge of the possibly flat earth or propel themselves far above the ground, as far as a balloon might take them above the comfort of the oxygen-rich layers of the troposphere. A kind of somatic observation, the need to explore with our bodies the edges of what we know, is perhaps something that Marcel Bayer also encountered when he began his study of clouds a decade ago, lost in a stack of cloud photographs, he writes, "If you devote yourself to clouds and their study, you're lost. Swiftly seized by vertigo, in the desire to devote yourselves to a phenomenon, you end up being thrown back over and over again upon yourself. The object under observation, be it an individual cloud photograph or a scientific cloud observation as a whole, ceaselessly asks back, how do you observe when it comes to clouds and any object description involves a self-description?" As Wolchover's article calls out, climatological models have consistently fallen short in both uncovering the full magnitude of climatic episodes in the Earth's history and their ability to predict with real certainty just how hot the Earth might get, how fast, what is really causing this rise in temperatures, and how, and what impacts these changes will most certainly have. Quoting from Wolchover's article again, even after accounting for the differences in geography, ocean currents, and vegetation during these past episodes of extreme changes in global temperature, paleoclimatologists find that something big appears to be missing from their models, an X factor whose wild swings leave no trace in the fossil record. Evidence is mounting in favor of the answer that experts have long suspected but have only recently been capable of exploring in detail. As Matt Huber, a paleoclimate modeler at Purdue University, states, "It's quite clear at this point that the answer is clouds." 2/3 of the planet are covered by clouds at any given moment. And recent computer simulations of clouds suggest that as the Earth warms, clouds become more scarce. Fewer white surfaces to reflect sunlight back into space, meaning that the Earth gets warmer, leading to even more cloud loss. And clearly this is a feedback loop that promises to spiral out of control, but the tipping of the heat index is only part of the story. These particular clouds modeled, as you see here, are stratocumulus clouds, which tend to form and in fact express the kind of structure of the tropical tropopause layer, the layer of the atmosphere that holds our daily lives. Importantly, this is an interface, has a volume, which I can show. It's an interstitial space that acts as a barrier between the relatively mixed, well-mixed airs of the troposphere and the poorly mixed milieu of the atmosphere above in the stratosphere. Typically, the tropopause can be found between 5 to 8 miles above the Earth's surface, as a global average, and 11 to 12 miles over the tropics. This barrier space is pushed and pulled by temperatures in the lower troposphere, therefore higher around the equator, lower at the poles, as well as higher in the summer and lower in the winter. This diagram expresses the distance of the tropopause from the Earth's surface at 200 times their actual measure, which can be seen in the upper right-hand corner, where the line of the tropopause is basically indistinguishable from the surface of the Earth. On an average day, it is possible to see the troposphere. When a thunderstorm cloud flattens out into an anvil cloud, as the kind of long top one shown there, it is usually because the updrafts of the storm have reached the tropopause, where the environmental air is warmer than the cloudy air of the storm below. And so the cloudy air stops rising and then spreads out. We can think of the tropopause as the upper limit of the Earth's weather. And it is also the limit of the data collected of the world's atmosphere. As a spatial reference that we can all imagine, jet planes typically fly above the tropopause. So I would be willing to bet that we've all both flown through and above this space. These lines in coral at 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south of the equator express the rough geoposition of the stratocumulus cover and the tropical topopause layer. They also denote what is known as the horse latitudes, or the doldrums, this band of calm seas that has helped to lay the foundations of empires, cultural exchange, resource extraction, and life as we know it. And yet their constructiveness lie not in their stillness, but in their winds, reliable in their strength, duration, pattern, season, direction. In fact, this map drawn by Sir Edmund Halley in 1686 depicts those very winds and is considered the first meteorologic drawing. Created from his own experiences crossing the seas, and also from stories from various sailors from over the years, from other marine navigators. And what I would like to propose is that while these lines are drawn through the experience of a search for visible grounds, what has actually been drawn out is another type of ground altogether, one consisting of the convergence between atmospheres and grounds, airs and grounds, airs and soils, on the move of volume and calling into question the very concepts of solidity and formation. The space around the equator from 30 north to 30 south plays a crucial role in ordering a network of atmospheric pressure centers, highs and lows, that exist year-round. So in this drawing, the highs are represented by the dashed line and the lows are represented by solid lines. On the left-hand side, you have the summer pressures taken from July, and on the right, the winter pressures from January. If we think about how atmospheric pressure acts, for a high pressure system, this atmosphere is pushing down in the center hardest on the surface of the earth and pushing air out, spinning out. From a low pressure standpoint, it's pulling the air up from the center. So just to kind of play out, of these high and low pressure systems, some remain pretty consistent year-round, while others kind of slightly shift from one season to the next, or they change completely from high to low pressure systems. We can also see them kind of build over time in conjunction with cyclonic storms. Reading this drawing from left to right, from March to February, we can see the cyclonic storms kind of build with these pressure systems because those two things actually act together. The storms sort of draw out the pressures as they're forming. And within this network of atmospheric centers, we have 8 distinct monsoon regions that begin to emerge. And what calls them out as being different from other pressure centers is the rate and quantities of precipitation that these particular areas gather over the course of the year. Of course, those precipitation measures are taken over land only, and so not fully representative of all of the material coming out of clouds. But what I would like to suggest here, this is kind of all of those pressures pulled together, is that as those pressure points kind of pull in and out, focus over the course of the year of the ground, that convergence of air pressure pushing down brings into focus or pulls up the grounds that they then inhabit. And in fact, this is, Tim Ingold made this point much more eloquently than I can, about a kind of anti-stratigraphy or the kind of palimpsest of grounds, that this convergence of airspace, of atmosphere and ground kind of pulls into focus or pulls up above in creating something new. So if we return to the tropopause, we can also understand that over the course of the year, as it shifts in response to temperature and other dynamics, the monsoon, particularly the Indian monsoon, plays a significant role in its position relative to the Earth. And just as the tropopause itself is a volume, it also defines another volume, the shifting space of the troposphere that we inhabit, and keeping in mind that this boundary is the limit of both data collection and the atmosphere of weather, it seems somewhat significant that it moves. To take this a bit further, we have to begin to understand that the tropopause is not a complete barrier. It leaks. Strongly convective storms transport weather vapor up across the tropopause, which contains breaks or cracks near jet stream westerlies. And this allows an exchange between atmospheric and tropospheric airs. And as these events sometimes develop, they can impact our lives in ways that are surprising. During the summer monsoon, these fold events within the tropopause occur with the most prevalence around the Indian monsoon, specifically, but also around the horse latitudes generally. And if we take a sectional look at the mixing of airs within these folds, we can see stratospheric airs reach quite near the Earth's surface. These reaches, these foldings of differently mixed airs can create weather events, such as out of the ordinary intensities of rain that cause dramatic flooding. One event, in fact, that Andrew Turner, our monsoon scientist, mentioned to me last night were the dramatic floodings that took place in Pakistan in 2010. Or more recently, the significant flooding experienced in the Middle East and Kuwait just a few months ago. These are, not all scientists kind of agree on this. These are sort of newly studied phenomenons, and because they're sort of more frequently happening, we're more frequently getting out of the ordinary weather events. And so both thanks to new computational developments, but also events that kind of spur new ways of looking at things, kind of drawing new connections. There are some new studies that are kind of drawing these events and the tropopause together and changes in temperature globally. So in 1878, William Clement Ley delivered to the Meteorological Society here in London a lecture titled Clouds and Weather Signs. And in this talk, he spent considerable time addressing the disastrous state of nephrology relative to other branches of science, and called particular attention to the deficiencies of artists for their lack of skill in portraying clouds adequately enough to capture their significance for scientific study. And in thinking about what clouds might tell us in their connection to the ground, and their connection to the actual space that we inhabit, I sort of want to question what, in those early statements, in Marcel Bayer's statement about how we are caught up in the clouds if we choose to study them, and then also the ways that clouds were studied back then, that they were studied through trying to climb up through them. It was a very personal relationship. That perhaps that personal relationship is something that extends to all of us, that the clouds are a sort of reflection or a connection to us or between us and the grounds, that they pull us all together. And in this section, I think it's really within that kind of shifting of clouds that is part of the structure of an extending tropopause, an extending sort of relationship between that space of the troposphere or the edge of weather and what's happening below, where we begin to see, perhaps, this kind of movement of the monsoon, like further into the Himalayas, because as this drawing probably isn't showing very well on that screen, the kind of cloud structures that typically would end the monsoon rains at the first kind of barrier range of the Himalayas are now sort of leaping over those to provide a sort of 2-week window of monsoon rains for Ladakh. So I think this, with all of a sudden this enormous sensitivity that is apparent from past climates, isn't something that's just in the past, but it becomes a vision for the future. I think that this connection between airs and grounds, through pressures, through sort of the merging of these materials and bringing things in and out of focus, might cause us to question the prevalence of stratigraphy over horizons, over understanding layers versus mixings, and the primacy of looking to the ground for answers rather than looking to the skies, and understanding that those two things are structured together. That's it.
Thank you very much, Christina. And our final speaker, Varma, is an artist, researcher, and master's candidate at the Center for Research Architecture, Goldsmiths, University of London. His research is focused on environmental violence in West Texas. His background is in sound art and experimental music as a former student of Lamont, Young, and Marion Zazela. So thank you very much, Avi.
Sorry, Avi, I don't know which one it is.
I'll be pulling them up as
Which one is it?
right here. But I'll just pull them up as needed. We'll save that for a second. It's a great graphic. Thank you, Monsoon Assemblages, for having me. Thank you all for being here. I have the unenviable task of finishing out this panel, but basically what I'm going to be talking about is two things as they come together. One is ecocide, and the other is epistemic violence, and specifically through really digging into the way the sound in one particular raga, the Monsoon raga, is differentiated. So the conjunction of ecocide and epistemic violence has been a central matter of concern at the Center for Research Architecture, Goldsmiths, where I'm pursuing my graduate work. In my master's research, I'm attempting to develop methodologies and conceptual frames through which to address this often invisible form of colonialism. In this paper, I will build upon the CRA's previous body of knowledge and my own research to investigate how specific cultural ecologies associated with monsoon in India embody political and environmental transformations as much as does the built environment. I'll offer a brief material history of the harmonium, its relationship to the ragas of North Indian classical music, and then problematize the two by considering them in light of ecological systems theory and the semiotics of human, non-human relations. Though what I'm offering is necessarily provisional, I am working towards tracing, I would say, the contours of a non-Western epistemology of voice, sound, and testimony, and towards what new forms of situated testimony they may indicate. But to begin, let's consider the physical and oral objects of concern around which I will build this theory of epistemicide, the Monsoon raga and the harmonium. So, in the North Indian classical music system, Raga Miyanki Mulhar is the Monsoon raga, sung during the rainy season, and it's characterized by an extraordinarily unique movement around the third scale degree, Ga, representing it. Not really representing, but what it is it's the gathering of dark clouds on the horizon and the downpour of rain on the earth. And so this clip is from The Music Room by Satyajit Ray, which is, I'll go into in a sec, but here we are. All right, so no tabla, but yet with the introduction of the harmonium, the Western equal-tempered tuning system was overlaid on top of the traditional forms of intonation used in raga, creating epistemic dissonances within the very materiality of sound itself. So basically, raga is the tuning system is just intonation, right? So it's based on a set of simple whole number ratios. Equal temperament is this kind of approximate system developed so that you can move between harmonic registers, so you can do modulation, right, in the 19th century. And it's a kind of industrial development going along with the piano. So they're just two different kind of like tonal worlds. I'm not going to play any clips of the harmonium. In fact, the harmonium was banned from all India radio between 1940 and 1971. So in this context, the monsoon culture embodied in raga can serve as sort of an interscalar vehicle through which the material changes in colonial politics, environmental transformation, and art practices can be registered. So in its very design, the harmonium was an ecological phenomenon. As the British presence in India increased, they imported harpsichords and organs with them. However, these instruments, according to musicologist Matt Rahame, either broke on the long journey from Europe or deteriorated quickly in the heat and humidity of the Indian summer and monsoon. By contrast, after its invention in the mid-19th century, the harmonium was designed to withstand and, like a monocultural crop, be resistant to India's environment. Portable and durable, it was used by chaplains, explorers, and traveling missionaries. Soon after its introduction, the harmonium was adapted by Indian musicians, and by the early 20th century had achieved ubiquity. Typically, debates over the harmonium have been framed in sort of Manichaean terms: British or Indian, colonial, post-colonial, elitist, populist, conservative, Marxist, with the political and symbolic value of the harmonium falling variously on either side of these binaries. However, rather considering its effect sort of synchronically at various historical moments, I'd like to consider the harmonium as an ecological event, and in so doing, I will read its microhistory through the lenses of the cultural ecology of raga, the lens of ecological systems theory, and ultimately the legal architecture of ecocide. First, I'd like to consider, though, what kind of body of knowledge raga constitutes. My situated knowledge of raga comes from many years' advanced study with Lamont Young and Marian Zazila. So they were two of the founders of minimalism as a musical and artistic movement and the original artists of the Dia Art Foundation. They were also, in their own right, the first Western students of Pandit Prannath, a master of the Karana Gharana school of raga singing, and he was the music director for this film, so he curated this scene, for example. So a raga in this lineage is defined as a set of musical elements, including a modal scale, characteristic ascending and descending variations of the scale, characteristic melodic phrases, motifs and patterns, characteristic ornaments, conventional pitches for beginning and ending phrases, special shrudis, microtonal pitch values, and circons, subtle shades, note particles, above or below the precise svara, which is a pitch. There are ragas to be sung in winter or spring, to be sung as the sun comes up or just after sunset, ragas about the desert and the long shadows of summer. Each raga has its own unique, nuanced, and highly calibrated system of intonation. And within this finely articulated musical system, Myanki Mulhar articulates Monsoon. And it's defined by this iconic movement around Ga, this andolin, this swinging motion, signifying once again the dark gathering of clouds in the sky and heavy rains around the earth. So this raga was composed by Tansen in the 16th century, and a series of sort of mythopoetic narratives surround the raga. The following anecdote by journalist and scholar Marcus Boone about a performance of Prannath's is paradigmatic. At the All India Radio Music Conference in Delhi in 1953, attended by many of the giants in the classical music scene, Prannath's performance of the rainy season raga, Myanki Mulhar, stunned the 5,000-strong crowd. Singer and early disciple Karunamai recalled that when he hit the sa note, he held the breath of us all, collected our breath through his own breath, held it at one pitch, and then let it go. When he let go, we all let go, all 5,000 people in the audience. It was a shock to me. All this can be done with music. And when he ended, there was torrential rain. Suddenly he got up. He was very sad and frustrated and angry and said, "I'm not a musician, I'm only a teacher," and stormed off, which is quite temperamentally accurate. But I think that idea of this monsoon brings the rain is very It's part of the culture. At the very beginning of the film, right, you saw the clip, there was just the moments of lightning and clouds. And through this description, one begins to encounter the unique epistemic terrain of raga. It is an episteme of reflexive animacy, one in which, according to anthropologist Julie Cruikshank, humans and nature mutually make and maintain the habitable world. Monsoon is, in Miyanki Mulhar, an animate and operative actor in establishing the very conditions of relationality and encounter. The raga constitutes an epistemic universe in which Monsoon is a living but non-organismic, more than human entity. And so this fragile site of assembly is contained largely within the devotional treatment of that single swinging pitch. So how is it that the harmonium, utterly incapable of recreating these sounds, managed to be a vehicle of terraforming and epistemicide? So these images are from Stephanie Wakefield, who's an urban geographer at the New School, and they're coming from sort of resilience theory of ecosystems. The introduction, of the harmonium in India marks what in contemporary resilience theories of ecosystems is called a regime shift. In the adaptive cycles of ecological regime change, a mature system suffers a triggering event such as a forest fire, undergoes a transformative period of creative destruction, after which it cycles through phases of renewal, structural reorganization, and adaptation. In the diagram above, the harmonium is a triggering device, an indirect agent of crisis and creative destruction. As Agent Orange was the instrument of herbicide, and blankets infected with smallpox were instruments of genocide, so the harmonium was an instrument, I argue, of epistemicide. As Dilip da Cunha might frame it, with the harmonium, the sound of the monsoon shifted from being the sounded moment of reality, from being the central force and point of assembly of its culture, and from being at home to being a guest within its own relational life world. To study the harmonium after it has attained cultural ubiquity, which is sort of how most contemporary musicological studies are approaching it, and after it's been reincorporated and adapted into musical practices, is to miss the crucial events through which the epistemic shifts of the colonial encounter are tangible. The sound of monsoon in Miyanki Mulhar is not symbolic in the sense of operating at the level of deferring chains of representations and significations. Rather, it is illustrative of what anthropologist Eduardo Kohn describes as the ways in which the whole that is symbolic is open to those many other habits that can and do proliferate in the world that extends beyond us. Conversely, the sonic representations of the harmonium, in which the sound of the monsoon raga is impossible, impose an architecture on sound that connects it not to such an extensive cosmology, but to an enclosed approximation of British colonial out-of-placeness in the climatic extremities of the monsoon and summer seasons. In Cohn's human, non-human semiotics, this kind of segmentation not only disarticulates a particular semiotic system, but as well effaces the way the semiotics of raga points to the future and the past of an aesthetic universe. It attacks relationality itself, and is structural, therefore, in its violence. It is what Vandana Shiva describes as a monoculture of the mind, quote, over and above rendering local knowledge invisible by declaring it non-existent or illegitimate, the dominant system also makes alternatives disappear by erasing and destroying the reality which they attempt to represent. The fragmented linearity of the dominant knowledge disrupts the integrations between systems. Local knowledge slips through the cracks of fragmentation. It is eclipsed along with the world to which it relates. Therefore, an understanding of the type of knowledge embodied in Miyanki Mulhar and the type of accidental systemic partitioning introduced by the harmonium affords one a unique case study through which to understand the types of shifts in ecological and social relations enacted in colonial encounters. I argue that the encounter between raga and the harmonium was an encounter between incommensurable relationships to sound and to what sound mediates, variously devotional relations, histories, potential futures, and the monsoon. At this point, the question that's sort of buzzing for me, it's informing my research, as I say formally, one that remains unanswered too, is how epistemicide may be evidenced, spoken for, mediated, seen as real, and therefore become a political speech act. To conclude my paper, I ask how epistemicide might be situated within a legal frame. As I've suggested already, ecocide and epistemic violence go hand in hand, right? The changing of the environment, the changing of the culture around raga. And so we're going to transition very rapidly to a conversation about ecocidal law for like 2 or 3 minutes. In ecocide law, one begins to see the reality of epistemic violence find veridiction. So through looking at ecocide, we can find a kind of strategy through which a kind of like invisible form of violence can be manifest and seen as fact. Emerging during the US war in Vietnam, ecocidal law sought to extend crimes against humanity to include forms of high technology counterinsurgent warfare. This is according to Richard Falk, writing in 1972, that perpetuated harm against the environment through the use of herbicides, the use of plows to achieve deforestation, bombardment or artillery fire that causes craterization, indiscriminate destruction and severance of human and animal linkages to their habitats, and weather modification. Yet embedded too within this legal reappraisal of excessive military tactics in terms of environment was, as the thinking around ecocidal law evolved, a further extension of the registers of ecocide to include the psychological and social harm that occurs when devastating damage is done to an environment. For example, Jim Glassman describes in 1992 the destruction of rural areas in Guatemala by US-backed militaries as a form of population control meant to drive both insurgents and indigenous Mayans from their land. This uprooting function to, quote, undermine psychological resistance by breaking an age-old and symbolically loaded bond based on the production and reproduction of life between indigenous communities and the earth. Therefore, if one thinks of social form as a kind of spatial and environmental organization that is an emergent property of that society's social relations and ways of being in the world, then necessarily ecocide is epistemicide. Very simply, you might say that if you change the space, you change the people in it. And more provocatively, by reversing that perspective, you might even say that if you change a people's way of relating, you change the space they live in. I think maybe I'll end there. Thank you very much.
So I'll invite all the speakers to join us on stage. Thank you all very much for this series of amazing presentations. I think it's quite exciting, the work that was presented. I'll start with a couple of questions and then we'll open up for the audience to follow up. Perhaps I'll start with one around continuity and discontinuity, which is something that reverses old work, and around representation. So all the 3 presentations speak of certain insufficiencies or that exist within existing systems and modes of representation of environmental or climatic and socio-environmental relationships. Now, when one produces a different mode of representation, and in this case I'm referring more specifically to the first 2 presentations, even though the question politically is structured by the third, when one produces a different type or new mode of representation, we know that it exists in a specific context, in a specific social institutional field. So perhaps my first question regards the instrumentality of representation and what type of political and what type of political conditions, but what type of institutional conditions need to change and in what ways, so that the experiments with representation that the first 2 speakers made can have a certain purchase. And I'll start through there.
So regarding the work I've done with the critical zone, so we start to work with the scientists. So in a way, this view has been presented to them, and they react to them. So it's already spread in their institution. So it's at the IPGP, Institut de Physique du Globe, in Paris. And then I hope that it could be also take for the landscape design. So in a way, it's also another institution, but it's also, I think that there have to be crosswalks, more links between the two of them, between the landscape design and the work of science, because without this knowledge, we can't invent new way of representation. And I mean, cartography, as we know, Aryan view, has been also made by science, by NASA, actually, and to study also climate. So I don't know if I answer, but...
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Alexandra in terms of, I mean, I think that the design disciplines and science, etc., need to work more closely to develop these drawings. It's on. So, I mean, I think there needs to be more sort of cross-disciplinary work in that way. This is a question that we struggle with this within the project in terms of how do we develop cartographies that at some point can depart from typical cartographic projections and talk about try to map things like volume and kinetic living beings, etc., in a way that isn't flat and that perhaps can incorporate sort of the fourth dimension of time in different ways, but at the same time kind of carries a weight and a language that can cross disciplines. And this is the thing that cartography has kind of been able to do, weirdly enough, over the course of history, is kind of bridge that gap between arts and sciences and various disciplines within sciences in a way that other representations kind of haven't. Not entirely, of course, there are exceptions, but so I think we're kind of trying to work on representations that have, now I sound really weird, that have a kind of cartographic grounding, but that we can evolve that into something else. And right now, everything is it's just a stage of process. So the drawings that I showed today are an evolution of things that were done a year ago, perhaps, and they'll be, further developed as we go. I mean, I already look at them now, and there's tons of things that I think are wrong. So it's just this thing that well, if you flip it this way or flip it that way, but which communities are you then excluding from being able to read them?
To follow up on that, there's a beautiful continuity between the three presentations around acoustics, in a way. The capacity of sound to capture the arrival or the encounter between the atmosphere and the soil, which then leads into a continuity with the types of mechanisms that you use to capture what is under the soil. But in there, I suppose acoustics brings us together to this point that you're looking at in terms of epistemicide, if one wants, and the encounter between specific modes of knowledge production around environmental relations. In one side, let's say, reflective seismology and mechanisms of capturing the underground, the way that they are deployed today by technoscience. On the other side, raga. Both of them touching each other through sound. Even though the question following on the previous question of representation aims to capture certain discreteness of existing modes of cartography, of existing modes of capturing environmental relations, it stays very much within the conventions of the drawing. Or conventions within or conventional separations between modes of representation, let's say, the drawing, the song, the painting, the film, etc. I was wondering, and this now for the three of you, because you come from the other perspective, right? Coming from music and trying to understand how it plays out and spatializes ecocidal relationships. Do you, in your work, always keep these two things separate, the drawing and the acoustics, or where do they come together? And I would suggest to fold that as well, if possible. Where does acoustics sit within your works, with this suggestion of encountering between, let's say, very different perspectives and very different modes of knowledge production? So I'll throw sound at the interception of your three works to see if you want to pick it up.
I get to go. Okay. Thanks. So I guess what I kind of want to answer this question by thinking about the first question, because I think of it as sort of not so much about like a representation as existing sort of figurally in front of a ground. So I think a lot, for me, like as I'm thinking about sound, I have a specific sort of like political ecology which I have in my mind, which is not this, but which I'm bringing to the table when I talk about this, which is sort of ongoing easement of pipelines in the U.S. and their extension, right? So when it comes to the representation of sound, I think about it in a really simple way about who gets to speak and when does it get heard, how does it get heard, and when does it become politicized, in a way that it in the sense that not just sort of raising awareness, but in the sense of having purchase. I don't know if that's a really great framework for it. I guess that's a representation in its own right. So for me, it's more along the lines of the first question, which is that I think about like how do you erase the representation and just think about the context of the representation. And so for me, that's because I was talking about law. To me, I'm very, very interested in the idea of situated testimony, which is something I'm kind of immersed in, pursuing, forensic aesthetics and sort of those kinds of investigations. And I think that there's that when if you think of it like sort of a figure, a ground, when the figure starts to be mirrored in the ground is when I think it starts to become troubled in a really interesting way. And I think that's I've lost the question, but that's my answer.
Yes, I'm not specialized in acoustics. I mean, it's very not my world. But in a way, also when scientists look at their instruments, they capture sounds. In fact, you can hear in the trees the movements of water in a way. But I think, as it's not my world, it's better to enter in a collaborative work with others. And I'm not doing that at the moment because I'm doing sort of academic in this presentation. But I think in the exhibition, also it's rejoin your question about institution. Exhibition can do that and bring together sounds, visuals, and much more. So yeah, I think we can think of that also.
Yeah. So the drawings. I didn't explain it today, but did yesterday. The drawings are made using a variety of data sources and also stories. So we use kind of big data collected from NASA, NOAA, USGS, etc., and then some more like local research, smaller systems based stuff. And then also the field work where we talk to people and try to bring those stories or those encounters with the monsoon like into a form of representation. So I think right now, so far, we're kind of dealing at a scale where it's really difficult to bring voices or small narratives into those drawings, which points to two things. One, scale as a potential issue, a sort of disjuncture, but also that the drawing fails, like it just fails to bring people into the grounds or into the airs. But then there are, I mean, if I point to like one thing, which you couldn't see because the line weight's on the screen, but in John's section here over Ladakh, like the data actually doesn't show that the monsoon is now occurring for 2 weeks in Ladakh, but that's from stories on the ground. So we're trying to sort of draw these things in, but I think we're just about to make that jump into a different focus or scale of drawing where maybe we reverse the primacy of data over narrative, and I have no idea what that looks like yet or what it sounds like. So
before I open to the audience, I'll just conclude with one final question. So picking up on all these answers. In your last presentation, you locate the debate between continuity and discontinuity as a core political moment. Something that is present, in Gandhi's comments on the harmonium, in Tagore's comments on the harmonium. So a specific mode of representation, let's put it like that for the moment, is actually politically constituent. There's a political project in that discussion. So that's one point. We typically discuss representations in terms of lack, right? It doesn't capture this, it doesn't capture that. Now we have the Anthropocene, oh my God, it needs to capture all of that, right? But if you look at that example, what we understand is that representations are never questions of lack. They're always specific decisions upon what is registered and what is not registered, the interventions, right? So we need to capture discreteness versus we need to capture time, we need to capture a spiral versus a circle. Those are all these decisions. Yeah, to represent is to select. So my final question is if you could speak a bit, perhaps even on a personal, not necessarily institutional level, if you could speak a bit more about what is the political project that you're engaged in?
With the representations for this particular project,
and the specific political dimension, what is the punch that you're punching?
I mean, I'm interested in creating provocations for just a new way of understanding what we inhabit. Not the place that we inhabit, but actually what we inhabit. I think kind of I guess this is where I think that the politics of the drawing or the cartography has a lot of power in sort of revisioning the map that we all already know and seeing it through another set of forces and elements. That would, I think it has to throw into question like every political boundary and every sort of the way that we think about availability and opportunity and relationality in general. So that, for me, I think that's my political ambition within that.
I think, I don't know if the political can be claimed in the world, in this work, but at least we can describe more precisely what is a terrestrial, because in a way we still live on this image of the globe. So maybe I may refer to Bruno Latour and his last book, Waterir, down to earth in English, where he describes that we all live in different worlds, actually, but very materially. So a way to try to build a common world in the terrestrial is to describe better where we are, where we land, And this is a big question actually, because with the Anthropocene, we don't know in what kind of space and what kind of time we are. So it is how can we situate better and allow also other voices to be heard, because we don't earn voices in kind of map of aerial map. There is many voices silenced, so to do field works also and to go on the site and to collect different observations and different way of life also in the territory, is also to bring back and to construct something. Yeah, it's a.
I feel like I need to confess, because we have crits on Monday, and I'm making all of these maps, and they're all two-dimensional, and like so I feel like I should like implicate myself in the conversation. But in terms of specific politics, I would say that I'm coming from. It's all about representation, and I think of like Glenn Coulthard's work, Red Skin, White Masks, where he talks about representation as a lack, as a really flawed sort of like political endeavor, because of the systems of reincorporation that automatically kind of continue doing the partitioning in the representation. So that's kind of one thing that I'm have in my mind. But I guess it has to do, for me, it has to do with like it's in my bio. You know, the environmental violence, the pipeline, the construction of pipelines right now in the U.S., how it's re-perpetuating settler colonialism, and how like even when you have a moment where you have sort of like Pete Heflin, who's a member of, this is hyper-local in Texas. There's a member of the Society of Native Nations. He goes to the Railroad Commission and confronts Kelsey Warren, who's the CEO of Energy Transfer Partners, Dakota Access Pipeline, Trans-Pecos Pipeline, Comanche Trail Pipeline. They come face to face. They have this amazing encounter, and he says, you know, you're digging up sacred burial grounds, you're polluting the earth. And Kelsey Warren says, no, that's not happening. And it's sort of, there's a testimony which is happening in the space of power in the capital of Texas. And it's just this total disjunction. And so that's where how do you intervene in that? Like, where's the point of entry? So that's sort of, but it's not like a neutral point of entry. It's a point of entry from the perspective of, you know, a decolonial sort of politics.
Perhaps we take a couple of them at a time. So, one here.
Thank you. It's a question for Avi. I was really fascinated by the use of these principles of ecological disturbance that leads to destruction and reorganization, and you focus mostly on this point of destruction, but ecologically there's also that point of creation, of reorganization that leads to something else. And resilience generally comes out of this constant process. And I was wondering whether you're looking also at that next stage in the process, which is somewhat more positive as well. Do you
want to take a few, Godofredo?
I would like to, if there are.
Hi, thanks for three really, really interesting presentations. To Alexandra, I wanted to ask, what was the limitation of the spiral? How far can the spiral go? To Christina, I was curious about what determined the title of your presentation, which was about dragons. And to Avi, so I can see how the harmonium is part of this colonial apparatus, but what is it doing? What is it doing with Malhar specifically? Because the harmonium has essentially transformed all of Indian classical music and all of Indian dance traditions, especially in the South, ones that have been, operated by Brahmanical forces, especially. So I'm just wondering what is specific about Malhar and the disruption of Malhar's attunement with the monsoon and the harmonium.
likes to start?
So, thanks for both your questions. They're kind of, they can kind of be answered in the same framework, as far as I understand them. So I would say that with Mahar, I think that okay. First, to the first part of the question about the harmonium, and that I think that if you look at it within that sort of resilience model, you have the sort of triggering event, right, which is the moment of creative destruction. You have the sort of back loop creative moment where the system reorganizes and incorporates the harmonium into it. So that's kind of what I was getting at with that. When you, I wanted to go back to this moment where you have sort of like these different kind of cosmologies coming into contact, right? So obviously right now the harmonium is totally, it's at a point of ubiquity. I mean, I would disagree. I think certain schools and traditions have different relationships to the harmonium, specifically within vocal music, because its tuning system is so different. The specificity of Mohar, I mean, what I wanted to get at, and perhaps I didn't do this as much as I should have, was that the way that like sound as a form of like language and as kind of like a representational form is relational in like Eduardo Cohn's sort of version of non-human semiotics, right? And so for Mohar, it's you have this relationality which is but formally it's formally, what's the right word? Like paradigmatic of raga as a form. So you have raga, and then you have Mohar, which is, so raga itself is relational, right? And then you have Mohar, which is specifically relational to the environment. The harmonium can't even, I mean, you can't even play it on the harmonium. It's just a very, very extreme difference, I would say. I think that kind of addressed yours as well. A little bit. I mean, there's, if I understand it correctly, how does the epistemic changes, it's I don't know, because it is, to me there's no going back, which is what's interesting to me and which is what's also kind of violent. And so it's important to, for me at least, to like get at a sense of like what, I guess for me, what is a kind of like loss or grieving around an aesthetic form. Not that it's gone, but that there is a difference, which I've experienced. And so to locate it and to have an entry point into evoking all the kind of like systems of relation and theories that I'm wanting to, I wanted to go back to this point of entry, right, which is the triggering event. And then, I mean, I could speculate on the changes in the model. I mean, one big one would be that, so my teachers are American artists, right? And so that would be sort of the moment of reorganization and resilience in terms of the form of raga, right? So you have Pranath, who moves to New York City and then has a bunch of, you know, New Yorkers as his students. And then I'm coming from Texas, right? So it's sort of embodied with the people who are continuing the practice. You know, and their other student is sort of is Jung Hee Choi, who's a Korean artist. It's a really kind of strange and weird network that forms after the point where there's this triggering event. Sorry.
So I go back to the question. So how far is a spiral? So actually, is a question of the limitation of the critical zone. So it depends first. More technical question. It depends first of the type of soils we observe. So it depends of the observatories. How deep is the rock beneath, and then as the spiral is a cycle, it can be it can make a loop at the scale of the observatory, so it leaks. So I didn't show that on the model, but we are thinking also, can we show some phenomena are in a loop in the observatory, but others are leaking.
In the long history of cartography, the edges of the maps, like the edges of what we know were either marked by like drawings of monsters or dragons, and then within English like cartography in particular, at some point, I don't remember the date, but they started to actually write, "Here be dragons," at the edge of what was known to be in existence. So, I mean, I think of the methods and the kinds of work that we're doing as both trying to address the edges of what is known, the edges of what is already mapped, and at the same time generating new edges, like new dragons, as you go. Because the methods used or the data is kind of both like 100% empirically factual and 100% potentially fictional at the same time.
Sorry, can I just ask a follow-up question if nobody else has a question? Thank you so much for the responses. Avi, so with Malhar, and obviously the many other ragas in subcontinental languages and music forms that are monsoonal, I mean, there seems to be a consistent inconsistency in what a raga is anyway, that it constantly evolves through interpretation, and even Mian Ke Malhar and its origin from Tansen and Meg and God, there seems to be a certain kind of storytelling in how a Malhar comes into being. So I guess my question, or my lack of clearly sort of framing it, is really sort of coming from this anxiety of, well, weren't ragas like Malhar, for example, always evolving with the transformation of the cloud and the rain and the air? And so in a way, they are inherently relational always. Like, I mean, a Malhar in Rajasthan is not the same Malhar in, say, Delhi, or it's not the same Malhar in Karnataka. So I'm just wondering, therefore, for your analysis, is there a certain kind of linguistic territory that you're speaking to or you're thinking with in producing the theoretical world that you're talking about?
So yes, it's coming from what. So it's obviously coming from. Oh, sorry, there's some commotion in the background. But where I'm coming from is with the Karana Gharana, right? So that's North Indian classical music. It's about 3 hours north of Delhi. That's specifically where I'm coming from. It's specifically about their treatment of raga, and it's specifically about the pitches, the third scale degree Ga, and the way it moves. And you can hear that well, I only played one of the two clips, but in the clip that you saw, you hear that the Andolan, and I'm necessarily kind of hesitant about going too into that, because it's a kind of, it's not mine it's not my knowledge to share, if you know what I mean. But I think that what you're saying is really on point in terms of like, it's perhaps like an architecture or a device in the larger theoretical body of work that if you zoom in, it maybe pixelates in a way that is not persuasive in the way that I would want it to be, because you can't really universalize raga. I would say that the kind of relationality, or you can't universalize all raga, right? Because there's so many different schools, and then the continent is the subcontinent is very large. And so, but I would say that it's not sort of like a neutral, natural transformational cycle. And there is a preservative aspect in the way pitches are taught and how much time you have to spend getting the tuning right. So there isn't like a kind of like a algorithmic drift, like a drunken wobble or something where the raga is changing shape. Like, I think that there's diversity of interpretation, but it's in a very like, in my experience with the art form, like very, it's a micro terrain that, comparatively speaking, in terms of the way these things shift. So what I'm thinking about is the pitches themselves. And so it's about the tuning of the pitch, the way it's used in the raga, and then compared to the harmonium, which it doesn't even exist in. But I really appreciate that kind of comment, and I think it's very helpful.
Do you have time for one final comment?
I think we do.
Okay.
I would actually have to check that.
So thank you for 3 absolutely fantastic presentations. I learned such a lot. I think, and also Godofredo, for you raising the questions about the political purchase of this work. I mean, I think that's an absolutely key question that probably bears more discussion. But just two questions, stroke comments, one for Alexandra. Your folding of the Earth was just absolutely brilliant, and I think opened up a whole new way of thinking about the planet we live on. But my question really is about the relationship between the strata and the spiral, once again. I mean, thinking of Tim Ingold's presentation last night, because in inverting the planet, you don't kind of de-stratify it, you just turn it inside out. But the spiral seems to me to unfold the kind of messy relationality between the strata. So I just think that there's something interesting going on there between strata and cycle, which maybe you could comment on. And then, I mean, also just to Avi, this idea of the harmonium and the epistemological ecocide, or however you term it. It seems to me that there's a similar story in the lines that represent wind on the map, and I was interested that, Christina, you use Haley's map with those lines representing wind, and the kind of epistemic violence that did to the wind and other ways of representing it. So I just think that there's a moment in time where that epistemological assertion of a kind of averaging out of environmental phenomenon that the West were uncomfortable with kind of emerges in a whole lot of forms, including cartography, that might be interesting to follow up on. It's really just a question for you.
Yes, but it's actually the 2 steps that I trying to describe. The passage from the circles to the cycles, actually. So we first we have first thinking about what could be a right representation of the Earth from within. So we reconstruct the strata actually around a point, a specific point, which is the observatory, in order to depict the landscape by its depth and to flatten it. And the way it's related to cycles, it's kind of intuitive work also, because when you have circles, you can more easily depict the cycles, and in fact, geochemists don't work too much with the stratigraphy. They are not stratigraphers, and so they follow the cycles. So that's interesting, that they don't have this so much this kind of separation between the different depths, but they trace the movement between each depth, and this kind of inversion of the structure of, I don't know, the strata allow us to map the cycles. I don't know if I can clear, but yeah. And in the last slide that I show, I try to make this how do you say, to merge this 2 kind of representation. I don't know if you remember. It's both topographical and cinematological. So I try to think about this also, how to transform our representation of topography into a more dynamic and movement around these different strata.
If there are no further questions, I think we'll conclude this session. And thank you very much for the panel, for the brilliant presentations.